At 4:42 every morning, in a chilled warehouse on the outskirts of Łódź, a sorting algorithm finalizes delivery instructions for hundreds of pallets. Carrots from southern Spain, onions from Serbia, packaged grains transshipped through Hamburg. Within minutes, forklifts begin loading trucks that will drive east, west, and south to major supermarket chains, regional distributors, school canteens, and prison kitchens. By noon, the products will appear on shelves, stacked into familiarity. Private labels, national brands, health-conscious alternatives. The illusion is one of abundance, competition, choice. But the algorithm that arranged these deliveries, the sequence of who receives what, when, and how, operates from a permissions file, last updated 9 months ago in a secure facility in Zurich. That file doesn't list suppliers or retailers. It lists priorities, spoilage thresholds, substitution rules, failure tolerances, and pricing margins during surge conditions. It's not controlled by a supermarket, a logistics company, or a government agency. It's controlled by a clearing structure, licensed through a private entity that hasn't changed names in 37 years. That entity belongs, in a distributed, non-controlling, non-declarative way, to the Cantarell family. Most people have never heard of them, and there's no reason they should have. Because they don't grow the food, they don't sell the food, they just define how food moves. When most people think about who controls food, they imagine the obvious layers, the vast farmland stretching across continents, the farmers who plant and harvest, the conglomerates that process and package, the supermarket chains that choose what to stock, and the governments that regulate safety and subsidies. These are the visible participants, photographed in supply chain reports, mentioned in trade publications, referenced during food crises. Their influence is real, but it is also local, seasonal, and ultimately constrained. What few realize is that the actual stability of the food system, its ability to deliver not abundance, but continuity, relies on a layer that receives almost no attention. Distribution coordination. Not the physical movement of goods, but the permissions behind that movement. The contracts, the clauses, the substitution protocols, the tolerance levels. The logic that determines not what food is available, but where it goes first, and under what conditions it is allowed to be rerouted. There is no single organization that runs food distribution. There is no central switch. Instead, there is an ecosystem of logistics providers, inventory platforms, regional clearinghouses, and broker networks that depend on compatibility, procedural, contractual, algorithmic. And that compatibility rests on standards, fulfillment thresholds, perishability weights, overflow scenarios, and critical route designations. That is where the Cantarell structure operates. Not in production, not in retail, but in formatting. Their influence does not come from ownership of farms or factories. It comes from formatting the logistics systems that others use to manage risk. When a major European retailer needs to adjust its inbound freight due to regional flooding, it doesn't renegotiate with every supplier. It activates a contingency clause. That clause references a framework that dictates which goods can be redirected from where, within what window, and under what price reconciliation scheme. The framework wasn't written by the retailer. It was adopted, years ago, from a clearing protocol built to ensure continuity during transit shocks. That protocol, or its derivatives, now exists in hundreds of systems across the continent. Its language is familiar, its logic, default. In North America, a growing number of mid-tier suppliers use automated matching platforms to offload surplus inventory. These platforms claim to be neutral marketplaces, but behind each transaction is a weighting engine, one that ranks offers not only by price and proximity, but by fulfillment friction. That friction score is derived from a playbook of distribution tolerances designed in the mid-1990s by a consortium seeking to standardize perishable redirection metrics. The original model was financed in part by a Luxembourg-based logistics research foundation. The foundation's seed capital came from a dormant holding company, once managed by a now-defunct Cantarell subsidiary. This is not conspiracy, it is legacy. In the Global South, development agencies often contract regional distribution coordinators to implement school feeding programs. The logistics templates used to balance freshness, cost, and reliability under uncertainty are derived from open access toolkits. These toolkits, when traced, borrow heavily from a routing schema first tested in northern Italy during a localized truckers' strike in 1988. That schema was part of a pilot designed to test perishability-led fallback distribution. The testing firm no longer exists, but the schema lives on, updated, modular, and deeply embedded in humanitarian logistics pipelines. And so, the pattern repeats. You can see it in the overflow management system that determines which distributor absorbs excess during unexpected harvest surpluses. You can see it in the clause that determines whether tomatoes from Tunisia or Morocco get routed to southern France during Ramadan, based on storage compatibility, not demand. You can see it in the fine print of a procurement contract that dictates how many hours processed dairy can remain at dockside before triggering a cross-dock redistribution, a clause that cites a compliance matrix first published under a nonprofit logistics council, now archived by a holding firm with silent ties to the Cantarell Trust. All of these components operate independently. No one is running the system. No dashboard shows a single view. No regulator sees the whole structure. And yet, over time, the system bends toward a pattern. Reliable, reproducible, opaque. Food still moves. Stores remain stocked. Shelves are replenished. But when scarcity hits, when floods, strikes, geopolitical shocks interrupt the chain, the question of who eats first is no longer about production or price. It's about formatting. And that formatting, in more places than anyone realizes, still follows the quiet architecture that began with the Cantarells. The Cantarell family did not begin in logistics. They began, almost anonymously, in certification. In the early 1950s, Jules Cantarell, a civil engineer with a background in industrial refrigeration, left a position at a rail shipping consortium to launch a small technical bureau in Lyon. His specialization was narrow: temperature compliance audits for short-haul food transport. At the time, perishable freight was growing rapidly across Europe, but standards were wildly inconsistent. One region's acceptable transit range was another's spoilage threshold. Insurance claims were frequent. Litigation was growing. Jules offered something unusual: a harmonization service. His firm didn't transport goods. It didn't store them. It didn't buy or sell. It simply validated, impartially, quietly, whether a shipment had met the technical thresholds required to be considered fit for destination. At first, he worked directly with insurers, then with regional distributors, then with regulators, who needed a baseline for cross-border tolerance arbitration. The model scaled not through expansion, but through standardization. By 1961, his audit sheets, printed on thin blue paper, sealed with a rotary stamp, were accepted at 5 regional transfer hubs across southern France and northern Italy. They weren't official. They were just precise. The firm became known, not for its authority, but for its usefulness. Jules had one guiding rule: never handle the product, only define its conditions. This principle, passed down through 3 generations, became the foundation of everything that followed. By the 1970s, the firm, now operating as Cantarell Logistique Conseil, had quietly become a fixture in European cold chain documentation. Their templates defined not just temperature thresholds, but timing margins, cross-dock protocols, and fallback rerouting guidelines for time-sensitive perishables. Governments used their language in pilot programs. International agencies referenced their diagrams in trade facilitation handbooks. Private carriers began aligning internal policy with Cantarell tolerances to avoid conflict at receiving docks. But the family remained nearly invisible. They never built warehouses, never owned fleets, never operated under their own logo in public logistics chains. Instead, they expanded horizontally, setting up advisory firms, research initiatives, and standardization bodies that seemed independent, often non-commercial. Many were structured as cooperatives, others as public-private working groups. All were seeded with frameworks that mirrored Cantarell protocols. The second generation, Jules' sons Alain and Émile, formalized the shift. They understood what their father had intuited: that control over goods was volatile, but control over movement conditions was durable. So they focused not on capturing supply, but on defining what qualified as distributable, under what margin, through which routes, at what failure cost. In 1986, a pan-European logistics crisis caused by a widespread lorry strike nearly collapsed several major food distribution corridors. While governments negotiated exemptions, a little-noticed set of fallback protocols began circulating among regional distribution centers. They proposed a set of non-priority perishables redistribution frameworks, elegant in structure, free to adopt, operational within hours. The protocols were not signed, but the file headers matched formatting used in previous Cantarell pilot studies. By 1992, the family's influence had fully migrated from documents to structure. A quiet Luxembourg-based clearing trust, registered under unrelated names, began licensing a modular compliance matrix for food movement during emergency conditions. The matrix didn't claim authority. It offered certainty. And when pressure rose, floods, protests, border slowdowns, certainty won. The third generation, now dispersed across advisory roles, academic chairs, and technical committees, never spoke publicly. They never appeared on boards. They declined interviews. But they held editorships in the trade journals that defined logistics best practices. They chaired committees that proposed updates to perishability modeling. They ghostwrote technical white papers for regional development initiatives in Eastern Europe and West Africa. In each case, the principle remained intact. No direct involvement, no exposure, no final control, only formatting. Not what moves, but what qualifies to move. Not where food goes, but what conditions trigger a reroute. Not who eats, but who meets the threshold for delivery. And through this lens, the family's presence only deepened. They did not centralize. They dispersed. They did not brand. They embedded. And by the time their name had vanished from the documents, their logic had already been absorbed into the systems that determine how food moves and how, under pressure, it is withheld. By the early 2000s, the Cantarell influence no longer depended on offices, signatures, or even memory. What remained was a procedural landscape, stitched together by decades of habit, risk aversion, and structural compatibility. Their standards had become what logistics professionals sometimes call pre-adopted infrastructure. Documents, schemas, and protocols so embedded in the day-to-day operations of supply chains that no one questions their origins. They are not imposed. They are simply inherited and followed. At this stage, the Cantarell network resembled nothing like a family enterprise. It had become a lattice of quiet nodes, technical institutes, compliance validators, software libraries, and neutral coordination bodies. Most were not legally linked. Many had never heard the name Cantarell, but all of them, knowingly or not, functioned using logic that traced back, through formatting, assumptions, and interoperational constraints, to frameworks the family had introduced decades prior. A typical case: a distribution software suite developed in Poland in 2005 to help mid-sized vendors manage spoilage risk across fragmented cold chain corridors. The engine's core algorithm weighted inventory not by demand or price, but by rotation urgency thresholds. A concept drawn from a logistics white paper circulated in French agricultural cooperatives in the late 1980s. That paper, now archived only in fragments, was a Cantarell-authored pilot. The software went on to power regional distribution in 7 countries and was later acquired by a multinational inventory platform. Elsewhere, in Latin America, an NGO-led platform coordinating surplus food recovery programs used a redistribution logic that weighted perishable stock against a 5-tier priority model: public institutions, low-margin retailers, contract clients, spot bidders, and industrial feeders. That model had no formal attribution, but it matched, category for category, an old Cantarell fallback structure developed for managing reflow during warehouse overstock events in Southern Europe after the 1993 trade zone expansion. None of this was framed as policy. It wasn't ideological. It was structural. The system's true resilience lay not in its visibility, but in its redundancy. The same core logic appeared again and again, across languages, platforms, and jurisdictions, often implemented by different actors who believed themselves to be solving the same problem independently. But in truth, they were solving it the same way because they were using the same inherited tools. The family didn't need to maintain influence. The systems maintained each other. In West Africa, donor-funded food corridors used pre-certified procurement thresholds that mirrored Cantarell's tolerances for multi-point spoilage routing. In Central Europe, a freight insurtech startup modeled its liability scoring after historical redistribution behavior. Historical, in this case, meaning compliant with a template originating from a now-defunct Cantarell-advised consortium. In Southeast Asia, urban food platform startups unknowingly adopted efficiency backbones whose delivery logic matched old, adaptive cross-priority substitution models lifted from the Cantarell schema of rotational redistribution under pressure. Even the simulations used in crisis forecasting relied on datasets categorized according to a perishability hierarchy first proposed in a 1992 technical supplement, a document whose copyright was never renewed and whose formatting was replicated over time into over 200 institutional models. None of this required enforcement. The logic persisted not because it was defended, but because it worked, and no one wanted to start over. At a certain point, the most fragile structures are the ones that rely on decision makers. The most durable rely on defaults. And Cantarell's true accomplishment was exactly that: building defaults that no one questioned. They never issued mandates. They never wrote laws. They never needed a voice in public discourse, because by the time anyone looked, the structure was already in place. Who gets first delivery in a heat wave? Who is downgraded when a truck is rerouted? Which warehouse absorbs the perishable overstock? The answers didn't come from policy, they came from compatibility. And compatibility, everywhere that matters, had already been decided. In 2008, a regional harvest collapse in Central Europe triggered a chain reaction no one had anticipated. Unseasonal frost destroyed a large portion of root vegetables across Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Within days, inventory across northern warehouses began to shift. Retailers activated contingency protocols. Mid-tier distributors initiated substitution rules. In theory, the system had redundancies. In practice, the speed of redirection exposed a quiet hierarchy, not of ownership, but of access. Large retailers received their shipments first, sometimes rerouted overnight from neighboring countries. Institutional contracts, schools, prisons, hospitals, were fulfilled with partial delays. Independent markets, small-town grocers, and local wholesalers, however, saw nothing. Not for days. Some never recovered their stock. When policy analysts reviewed the incident months later, no rules had been broken. Every movement had followed existing contracts. Every substitution had been technically legal. But the pattern was unmistakable. Certain actors received food faster not because they had paid more, but because their logistics partners operated on priority frameworks that used a redistribution template. One first introduced, quietly, as part of a non-competitive stability clause during the 1991 Cantarell clearing pilot in Lyon. That clause wasn't proprietary. It wasn't even well known. But it had been absorbed, copied, rephrased, reused into enough fallback procedures that when pressure hit, the system behaved in a predetermined way. No decision was made. The structure simply followed its logic. This was not an isolated case. In the following years, structural shocks multiplied. Port closures, fuel protests, tariff disputes, sudden regional embargoes. In each case, the outcome wasn't determined by how much food existed, but by how quickly it could be moved. And that speed depended on pre-approved formats. Systems that had adopted Cantarell-aligned protocols performed better, not because they were newer, but because they required no time to negotiate exceptions. By 2014, a multinational logistics audit of subcontinental routing behavior showed that over 60% of rerouted shipments during surge conditions followed legacy-compatible redistribution sequences, meaning fallback movements obeyed spoilage thresholds, vendor neutrality conditions, and capacity-based substitution that all mirrored the original Cantarell clause logic, now embedded in at least 4 generations of logistics platforms. And still, no one mentioned the family, because by now, there was no family. There were only the echoes of their logic, alive in template packs, in training modules, in automated warehouse configuration defaults. A new generation of software engineers, writing fulfillment code in Java and Python, unknowingly called functions built around prioritization matrices calibrated decades ago by a consulting group whose name no longer appeared in any active business registry. In moments of calm, this structure remained invisible. In moments of disruption, it defined outcomes. One such moment occurred in 2017, when an unexpected labor strike at a major Mediterranean port diverted thousands of tons of produce. Competing distributors activated their rerouting algorithms. Some succeeded, some didn't. The pattern, again, revealed itself. Systems using structured flexibility matrices, a concept coined in an obscure 1993 Cantarell logistics workshop, were able to pivot. Others required manual overrides and failed. Governments responded by commissioning reviews. The reviews concluded that no systemic manipulation had occurred, only that the actors who had adhered to legacy-compatible redistribution procedures had suffered less disruption. That conclusion, repeated across multiple jurisdictions, quietly led to the widespread recommendation of those same procedures as industry best practice. And so, the logic deepened. More cities adopted the same framework for emergency procurement. More NGOs structured their crisis response around recognized fallback pathways. More digital platforms calibrated their substitution preferences against historical distribution behavior, unaware that the history they referenced was built atop Cantarell decisions made before many of them were born. The family had no brand, no presence, no voice. But their architecture had become something stronger. Not visible power, but invisible order. Not control by force, but stability by formatting. Not instruction, but infrastructure. When scarcity came, systems didn't debate, they followed. And what they followed, more often than anyone realized, was something the Cantarells had written. Not for influence, not for credit, just for permanence. By the early 2020s, the last vestiges of personal authorship had vanished. The Cantarell structure, if it could still be called that, no longer needed names, offices, or signatures. What remained was a distributed architecture of rules, logic, and compliance scaffolds operating beneath the surface of food logistics worldwide. It had become, in effect, a procedural terrain, not commanded by anyone, but navigated by everyone. The transformation was slow, almost glacial, but absolute. What began as a set of fallback clauses and tolerance definitions had evolved into a modular system of compatibility standards, too integrated to replace, too invisible to contest. The governance had dissolved into layers. One entity held archiving rights for redistribution protocols in humanitarian corridors. Another maintained datasets for risk-weighted perishability indexes used in donor-funded food resilience platforms. A third, a software licensing board in Amsterdam, certified digital twins for warehouse reflow planning. Each was technically independent. None were aware of the other's origin stories, but the formats aligned, the assumptions matched, the logic pulsed in unison. There were no Cantarell protocols by name, no trademarks, no foundation issuing updated versions. Instead, the updates happened organically, passed along by consultants, absorbed into procurement kits, taught in logistics certification programs. Every year, thousands of professionals across sectors were trained to use tools, clauses, and sequence logic that no longer referenced any person, but whose structure still traced, cleanly, quietly, to the same original spine. And with each generation of abstraction, the influence became harder to see and harder to remove. At a policy level, national food security frameworks increasingly referenced adaptive redistribution guarantees, a phrase standard across international development documentation, but one which, in its full procedural form, mapped directly onto the tiered failure protocols from the Cantarell clearing matrix of 1991. No one cited it. No one needed to. The shape was already embedded. At a technical level, AI-assisted logistics engines trained on historical supply chain performance learned redistribution behavior that had, over decades, conformed to legacy logic. These engines didn't reproduce Cantarell policies. They learned them and encoded them. In code, in simulation, in fallback automation. One such system, deployed in over 50 mid-sized cities to help local governments prepare for climate-induced disruption, categorized critical inventory tiers, rerouting viability, and contract cascade sequences using decision trees indistinguishable from archival Cantarell risk thresholds. The engineers believed they were optimizing, but in reality, they were reinforcing decisions made 30 years earlier, now ossified into data. Elsewhere, a consortium of food tech startups launched a standardized fair distribution API to facilitate equitable access across independent grocers. The API's back-end logic prioritized by demand risk score, freshness loss probability, and guaranteed absorption capacity. Each variable lifted, in structure if not in name, from Cantarell's 1989 reflow alignment model for surplus shelf stables. By now, the original documents were no longer even stored in legal archives. They lived inside machines. The last generation of the Cantarell family had long since disappeared from public view. Some had changed names. Others had entered academia or disappeared into private research. But none controlled the system. None needed to. The system had surpassed the need for intention. Power, at this stage, did not reside in decision makers. It resided in sequence. No actor could reverse a redistribution clause without triggering non-compliance in 20 interdependent systems. No regulator could outlaw a fallback tier without rendering a dozen procurement frameworks invalid. No software provider could rewrite inventory tolerance formats without breaking legacy compatibility and risking loss of insurance coverage for 1,000 shipments. The logic had detached from its origin. It was now self-referencing, self-validating, self-reinforcing. Like any true infrastructure, it persisted not because someone maintained it, but because removing it would cost too much. And in this way, the Cantarell structure accomplished its final transformation, from a set of decisions to an environment. Not a network, not a firm, a condition. Every truck reroute, every warehouse overflow, every quiet decision between two acceptable destinations now followed a path written by no one, enforced by nothing, and yet impossible to escape. The family was gone, but the system no longer needed them. It ran on inertia, and inertia had won. Today, when a pallet of shelf-stable goods leaves a regional hub outside Bucharest, or when a school in Dakar receives an emergency restock of cooking oil, or when a suburban grocery chain in Ontario reroutes its fruit shipments after a late frost in California, the decisions seem fast, efficient, even intelligent. Algorithms optimized the routes. Inventory managers clicked through options. Contracts were honored. Nothing appears out of the ordinary. But none of these actions are independent. Each one follows a path made possible only because it conforms to routing thresholds, to fallback sequences, to redistribution clauses buried deep inside vendor frameworks and government procurement manuals. Clauses written years, sometimes decades ago, by authors no longer known, their logic no longer questioned, their shape now so familiar that to deviate would feel like error. That is the mark of deep structure. Not that it commands, but that it removes the need for command. No one decides who eats first. But when shortages ripple through the system, a missed harvest, a blocked port, a cross-border delay, the system responds in silence. It routes, filters, defers, and each decision, layered on the last, moves food toward some and away from others. Not through malice, not through plan, but through sequence. And that sequence, more often than not, still reflects the quiet formatting rules introduced by a family whose name has vanished from the operational record. Retailers speak of supply chain resilience. Governments speak of food security. But underneath, the actual infrastructure, the ghost logic of eligibility, substitution, priority, hums with a tempo that began far earlier than most realize. A tempo not set by nature, nor by demand, but by formatting inertia. What began as tolerance definitions became redistribution scaffolds. What began as fallback planning became market structure. And what began as logistics support became something more enduring than ownership. There is no monument to the Cantaros, no archive, no museum, only a system that still moves food according to decisions no one remembers making. And that is the final form of influence, not visibility, not recognition, but inevitability. The shelf is stocked, the truck arrives, the shortages are quiet, the rules already followed. True power in infrastructure does not ask for attention. It does not rule. It does not speak. It waits. It watches. And it decides. Not all at once, not with intent, but with structure. Who eats and when.